On the night of February 3, 1868, at the Rail End tent camp above Blue Canyon, California, a 22-year-old woman named Sue Lin was led into a lantern-lit supply tent to settle her brother's unpaid passage debt of $180. She carried a jade pendant worn smooth by her mother's thumb, the only thing on her that was not already owed to someone. The camp's labor broker, a man named Pruitt, had chalked her name on a slate beside a crate of dynamite, as though she were another line of freight to be moved by morning. Everyone in that tent knew what happened to a woman traded to cover a debt at the end of the line. She went to whichever man's bid cleared the ledger fastest, and no one asked her what she wanted. What the miner in the back of the tent did instead, before Pruitt could call for bids, made the broker's pencil stop moving. His name was Nathaniel Cole, a claim holder who had walked down from his sluice at Blue Canyon to buy powder and rope, not a person. He set his coin pouch on the crate, counted out $180 in full, and told Pruitt the debt was paid, but the woman was not for sale, because a person could not be bought twice for the same money. Pruitt laughed, then stopped laughing when Nathaniel asked her, in the halting phrase he'd learned from a railroad cook, what her name actually was. Not the name chalked on the slate, hers. The tent went quiet enough to hear the sluice water running somewhere below the ridge, patient and indifferent to all of it, while Sue Lin decided whether a stranger's question was a kindness or a new kind of trap. He did not touch her arm to lead her out, though every man in the tent expected him to. He simply held the flap open and waited, the way a man waits for someone he considers capable of walking on her own. Sue Lin stepped past him into the cold with her bundle clutched against her ribs, uncertain whether she had traded one owner for a gentler one, or whether something else entirely had just happened in that tent. Behind her, Pruitt was already recalculating what he had lost and what he might still claim back before the season turned. By morning, the whole camp would know that Nathaniel Cole had paid a debt he did not owe for a woman he had never met, and the whole camp would have an opinion about why. Sue Lin knew only that she had a roof for the night, a name no one had used correctly in 6 weeks, and a brother still 3,000 miles away, whose passage she still had to find some way to finish paying. She followed the miner's lantern up the frozen trail toward his claim, counting her own footsteps in the snow because it was the only arithmetic she still fully trusted. The debt had begun 3 years earlier, in a village Sue Lin no longer let herself picture too clearly, because pictures of home had a way of turning into grief if she looked at them too long in the dark. Her brother Wei had gone first, borrowed against a broker's promise of railroad wages that would clear their family's debts within 2 seasons. 2 seasons became 4. The letters slowed, then stopped, then arrived again with a different hand holding the pen, explaining that Wei had been injured setting a charge on the Truckee grade and could not write, and that the debt for his passage, and now his care, had passed to whoever in the family could pay it. Sue Lin was the only one left who could. She had sold her mother's silver combs first, then a strip of family land no one else wanted, and when the arithmetic still would not balance, she had signed a contract she barely understood, promising labor and obedience to a broker named Horace Pruitt in exchange for passage to Gamson and the clearing of what remained of Wei's debt. She told herself the whole voyage that a contract was not a chain, that she could still choose the shape of her own days once she arrived, and she believed it right up until the moment Pruitt chalked her name on a slate in a supply tent and called it inventory. The camp at Blue Canyon was not what the broker's agent in Canton had described. There was no schoolhouse, no laundry with steady custom, no genteel household needing a companion who read and wrote. There was mud frozen into ruts, canvas tents patched with flour sacking, and 1,100 men blasting a shelf into granite so that a railroad could someday run through country that did not want it there. Pruitt had put her to work in his own mess tent within a day of her arrival, ladling stew and mending shirts for wages that went, every cent, against a debt that seemed to grow rather than shrink, itemized in a ledger she was never permitted to read herself. She had asked, twice, to see the figures. Both times Pruitt had smiled the smile of a man explaining arithmetic to a child, and told her the numbers were complicated and that she should trust him to keep them honestly. She did not trust him. She had no way to prove he was lying and no one to ask who might side with her over him, and so she kept ladling stew, kept mending shirts, kept the ledger's cruelty private, and waited for an opening she could not yet name. The night Nathaniel Cole walked into that tent for powder and rope, she had been folding linens in the back, close enough to hear every word, expecting nothing from it, because nothing in 6 weeks at that camp had ever gone the way she hoped. When Pruitt raised his voice to include her in a transaction she had not agreed to, she set down the linen and came forward only because refusing to appear would have cost her more than appearing did. She did not yet know the miner's name. She only knew that he had counted actual coin onto the crate, in full, without haggling, which no man at that camp had ever done for anything that concerned her. Nathaniel Cole had not planned to buy anyone's freedom that week. He had come down from his claim above Blue Canyon with a mule, $40, and a list in his own cramped handwriting, blasting powder, rope, a new sluice screen, salt pork if the trading post had any left. He was 34 years old, land poor in the way of a man who had staked a claim 3 seasons ago and worked it alone since his partner died of camp fever, and he had long since stopped expecting good luck to visit him in any form he recognized. He had heard, vaguely, that Pruitt kept a woman in his mess tent who had come over on a labor contract, and he had assumed, the way most men at the camp assumed, that it was none of his business how another man ran his outfit. What changed his mind was not chivalry, not exactly. It was the ledger itself, glimpsed over Pruitt's shoulder while the broker totaled his powder order, showing a debt that had somehow grown across 6 weeks of unpaid labor instead of shrinking, with fees added for board and lodging that no honest accounting would have charged against a person working full days in exchange for exactly that board and lodging. Nathaniel had kept his own claims book since his partner died, because no one else would do it for him, and he knew what a ledger looked like when a man was cooking it. He said nothing about the ledger. He only asked, when Pruitt mentioned in passing that the debt could be settled outright for the right price, what the right price was. Pruitt named a figure with the easy confidence of a man used to naming figures no one questioned. Nathaniel had exactly that much and $11 besides, money he had been saving toward a new rocker box for the spring thaw, and he set it on the crate without letting himself calculate what he was giving up, because he had learned on the claim that hesitation before a decision was often just fear wearing a more respectable coat. He was aware, dimly, that the whole tent was watching him do something no one at that camp did, which was spend real money on a stranger's dignity instead of a stranger's labor. He did not look around to gauge their opinions. He had judged men his whole life by what they built and what they paid for honestly, and he judged himself by the same measure now, waiting to see whether he would still respect the man he was in the morning. When he asked Sue Lin her name, it was not gallantry, it was the plainest question he had, the one Pruitt's ledger had never once bothered to ask, and he wanted, more than he examined at the time, to hear her answer it herself. Sue Lin gave him her name in careful, accented English, watching his face for the flicker of confusion or amusement she had grown used to whenever she spoke to a white man at the camp. It did not come. Nathaniel repeated the syllables back to her, twice, getting the tone slightly wrong both times, and asked, without apparent embarrassment, whether he had said it correctly yet. No one had ever asked her that before. Pruitt had called her Lucy from the first week, a name he had apparently decided suited her better than her own, and the mess tent regulars had followed his lead because it was easier than learning anything true. She corrected Nathaniel's pronunciation a third time, and he got it closer, and something in her chest loosened by a fraction so small she almost missed it happening. He told her, in the plain way he seemed to tell everything, that the debt on Pruitt's books was paid, that he did not know what she wanted to do next, and would not presume to decide it for her, but that she was welcome to shelter at his claim through the worst of the winter, if she had nowhere better, in exchange for honest wages for honest work, the same arrangement he would offer any hand he hired. He said the word wages with a particular emphasis, as though he wanted her to hear that it was not the same word as debt. She did not answer immediately. 6 weeks at Blue Canyon had taught her that kindness offered quickly could still conceal a hook, and she had promised herself, crossing the ocean, that she would not again sign herself into an arrangement she had not fully read. But there was no contract here, no ledger, nothing to sign at all, only a man holding a tent flap open and waiting to see what she chose. She thought of Way, still owed for, still somewhere on the grade with an injury she had never been permitted to see documented in writing. She thought of the alternative, which was staying in Pruitt's tent under a name that was not hers, in a debt that grew instead of shrank. She picked up her bundle, the one thing at that camp that was entirely her own, and stepped toward the flap he held open, not because she trusted him yet, but because for the first time in 6 weeks, someone had offered her a choice with an actual door in it. The walk up to Nathaniel's claim took the better part of an hour, along a trail that had frozen into ridges hard enough to turn an ankle if a person stopped watching their feet. Su Lin found the climb almost a relief after 6 weeks confined to a mess tent's narrow round of chores. The cold air stung, but it was honest cold, not the close, smoke-thick air of Pruitt's canvas. Nathaniel walked a few paces ahead with the mule, matching his pace to hers without seeming to make a point of it, occasionally naming a landmark in the dark, a split boulder, a stand of burned pine, the place the trail forked toward a claim that had gone bust the previous spring, the way a man narrates a road to someone he expects to need it again. She noticed he did not fill the silence when she did not answer. Most men she had met since leaving home treated her silence as an invitation to talk louder, to explain things twice as if volume were the barrier rather than vocabulary. Nathaniel simply walked and let the quiet be what it was, and she found she did not mind it. When they crested the last rise, his claim came into view, a single-room cabin of rough-cut timber with a stone chimney, a sluice running down toward the creek, a lean-to that served as a stable for the mule, and beyond it all the black shapes of the Sierra ridgeline against a sky just beginning to gray toward morning. It was not much. She understood that immediately, and understood too that he knew it was not much, from the way he did not apologize for it or oversell it, only said, "This is the place," plainly, the way a man states a fact he has made peace with. He showed her the cabin's second room, added on by his dead partner and never much used since, and told her it was hers if she wanted it, with a latch on the inside of the door. He said the words "with the inside of the door" with a particular care, as though he understood, without her having to explain it, exactly what kind of promise that latch represented. She lay awake most of that first night anyway, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of wind in unfamiliar pines, turning her jade pendant between her fingers, wondering how long it would be before this arrangement revealed its true cost, because in her experience so far, every kindness in this country had eventually presented a bill. The bill, when it came, was not the kind she had braced for. It arrived in the form of Nathaniel's cough, a rattling thing that had started as a nuisance in late January and by the second week of February had settled into his chest like something that intended to stay through spring. He worked through it anyway, because the claim did not forgive a man his health any more than Pruitt's ledger had forgiven Su Lin her labor, and each day he came back from the sluice paler than the day before, sweating despite the cold, insisting over supper that it was nothing, just a camp cough, the kind every man on the mountain carried by February. Su Lin had watched this particular denial before. Her grandmother had been the herbalist in their village, the woman other families sent for when a fever would not break or a child's cough turned wet and dangerous, and Su Lin had spent her childhood memorizing the contents of her grandmother's trunk the way other girls memorized embroidery patterns, which root for fever, which bark for a cough seated deep in the lungs, which combination should never be given to a person already weak from exertion. She had packed a small selection of that trunk's contents when she left home, not because she expected to need them for anyone but herself, but because a person did not cross an ocean without carrying whatever medicine she could. She had said nothing about the herbs for weeks, uncertain whether offering them would be read as presumption, or worse, as the kind of foreign superstition the camp doctor at Blue Canyon dismissed openly whenever the subject of Chinese medicine came up in his hearing. But by the second week of February, Nathaniel's cough had a wet, rattling depth to it that she recognized from her grandmother's warnings as dangerous, the kind that turned into something worse than a cough if it went untreated through a cold night, and she decided that the risk of his opinion of her mattered less than the risk of losing the one person who had asked her name and meant it. She brewed the first preparation while he was down checking the sluice gate, a bitter decoction of dried root and bark she had ground herself with the small stone mortar she'd carried from home, and she set the cup on the table without explanation beyond one word: "Drink," delivered with more authority than she generally allowed herself in his presence. He looked at the cup for a long moment, then at her, and something in her expression must have convinced him this was not a request, because he drank it down in 3 swallows and grimaced at the taste, and did not ask what was in it, which she took, correctly, as a form of trust she had not yet earned through anything but the coincidence of standing in his kitchen. The cough did not vanish overnight, because nothing in Su Lin's grandmother's practice had ever promised that kind of miracle, only steady improvement bought through consistency and patience, and she told Nathaniel as much when he asked, on the 3rd morning, whether the bitter tea was actually doing anything, or whether he was simply drinking it to please her. She answered honestly, in the plainer English she was gaining confidence in day by day, that the medicine worked over time, not instantly, the way a wound closes over days rather than the moment it is bandaged, and that stopping now because he felt no immediate miracle would waste the 4 days already invested. He accepted this the way he seemed to accept most things she told him with confidence, by simply doing what she said, and by the end of the first week the rattle in his chest had thinned to something drier and less alarming, and by the second week it was gone entirely, replaced by an ordinary cold-weather cough that any man on the mountain might carry without comment. He did not make a great show of gratitude, which she had come to understand was simply his manner rather than any lack of feeling, but she noticed that he began, without being asked, to bring her things from his trips down to the trading post. A paper twist of tea he thought might resemble what she was used to, a whetstone for the small knife she used to prepare her herbs, a bolt of plain cotton when her one spare dress began to fray at the cuff. Small offerings, none of them large enough to constitute a debt, each one delivered without commentary, set on the table the way she had set the cup of medicine on his, an exchange conducted almost entirely without words because words, in this arrangement, kept proving less reliable than the things people actually did for one another. It was during this stretch of quiet convalescence that she began, cautiously, to ask him things about the claim, how the sluice worked, what the rocker box separated and how, why some seasons the creek ran heavy with gold-bearing gravel and others nearly dry, and found that he answered her questions the same way he answered everyone's, without adjusting the vocabulary or the respect with which he explained it, as though it had simply not occurred to him that a woman, or a foreigner, or a woman who was also a foreigner, might need the explanation simplified. It was, she was beginning to realize, one of the more unusual courtesies she had been shown since leaving home, though she could not yet have said whether it was courtesy or simply the plain, unadorned way the man was built. Word of the arrangement reached Blue Canyon within the week, as word of anything unusual always did in a camp that size, where 1,100 men shared one trading post, one saloon tent, and an appetite for gossip sharpened by the tedium of hard labor in a cold season. The story that circulated bore only a passing resemblance to the truth. By the time it reached the churchwives who gathered on Sundays in the half-built frame chapel at the center of camp, it had become a tale of a miner who had bought himself a Chinese girl the way another man might buy a milk cow, and the wives received this version with the particular blend of scandal and satisfaction that gossip about a neighbor's moral failing tends to produce. Mrs. Abigail Reyes, the blacksmith's wife and the camp's most determined organizer of respectable opinion, made a point of saying within Nathaniel's hearing, the next time he came down for supplies, that a decent man did not keep a heathen woman under his roof without the sanction of marriage or the supervision of a Christian household, and that the camp expected better of men who called themselves God-fearing. Nathaniel had said nothing in response beyond a level "thank you for your concern" that closed the conversation as firmly as a door, and had gone about his purchases without further comment. But Su Lin heard about the exchange from the trading post clerk's wife, a quieter woman named Delphine Ashworth, who had taken to nodding to Su Lin in the street when other women looked away, and who reported it with evident discomfort at having to repeat it at all. Su Lin absorbed this news the way she had absorbed most unwelcome news since arriving in Gamsan, by folding it into the growing catalog of things this country expected her to apologize for, simply existing within reach of. She had not asked to be gossiped about. She had not asked to be rescued, or bought, or discussed after church by women who had never once addressed a single word directly to her. What she found, examining her own reaction that evening while she ground herbs by the fire, was less shame than a slow-building anger she did not fully trust herself to voice yet, because voicing anger as a foreign woman in a camp that already considered her a subject of legitimate gossip felt like handing them more ammunition. She said nothing to Nathaniel about what she'd heard, but she noticed, over supper, that he seemed to already know, from the particular careful gentleness with which he asked whether the trading post clerk's wife had been kind to her that afternoon, and she understood that the town's judgment had reached him too, and that he had decided, without consulting her, not to let it change anything about how he treated her at his own table. The real test of the town's opinion arrived not through gossip but through the assayer, a narrow, precise man named Josiah Whitlock, who controlled the only scale in Blue Canyon that the trading post recognized for weighing gold dust against credit, and who had, over the years, developed a reputation for shaving his measurements in his own favor against any miner too unsophisticated or too foreign to catch him at it. Nathaniel had used Whitlock's scale for 3 seasons without incident. mostly because he weighed his own dust carefully beforehand and knew within a fair margin what he was owed. But the week after the gossip about Su Lin reached its peak, Whitlock's scale returned a figure for Nathaniel's dust that fell nearly 15% short of what Nathaniel had calculated at the claim, a discrepancy too large to be simple error. Nathaniel argued the figure at the counter, and Whitlock, unmoved, suggested that perhaps the miner's own scale at the claim was the one running false, an accusation calibrated precisely to be unprovable by anyone without a third scale to arbitrate. It was Su Lin who solved the argument, though not through any confrontation. She had watched her father keep the books for a small trading concern before his death, and she had learned, alongside her grandmother's herbal trunk, an eye for numbers that did not balance. She asked Nathaniel, quietly, that evening, to describe exactly how Whitlock's scale was built and calibrated, and when he described the counterweight mechanism, she recognized immediately a method she had seen used dishonestly by merchants back home, a scale that could be tipped fractionally by the angle of the counter it stood on, invisible to a customer who did not know to check the level. She suggested, the next time Nathaniel went to weigh dust, that he bring a small level, the kind used in construction, and check the counter's angle before Whitlock ever touched the scale. Nathaniel did exactly that, in front of 3 other miners waiting their turn, and found the counter tilted just enough toward Whitlock's side of the transaction to explain the entire discrepancy. He said nothing accusatory. He simply set the level on the counter, let the other miners see the bubble drift toward Whitlock's favor, and asked, mildly, whether the assayer might want to reset his scale before continuing business that morning. Whitlock's face went the color of old ash. The story of the tilted counter moved through camp faster than the gossip about Su Lin ever had, and for the first time since her arrival, she heard her own name mentioned in a sentence that did not pity or condemn her, but credited her with catching a cheat that had apparently been fleecing the camp for months. Whitlock did not take the exposure quietly. A man whose entire authority rested on being trusted with an accurate scale could not afford to let a foreign woman's arithmetic stand as the reason. Half the camp now double-checked his counter before every transaction, and within days he had found a way to strike back that did not require admitting fault. He began refusing, politely but absolutely, to weigh dust for Nathaniel Cole at all, citing a newly discovered irregularity in Nathaniel's claim paperwork that required review before further business could be conducted. It was a thin excuse, and everyone including Whitlock knew it was thin, but it was procedurally sound enough that no one could call it outright retaliation, and procedural soundness, Su Lin was learning, was the primary weapon this camp's respectable citizens used against anyone they could not simply run off with a shotgun. Without a working relationship with the assayer, Nathaniel had no way to convert his season's gold dust into the credit he needed at the trading post, which meant no new blasting powder for the spring thaw, no replacement parts for a sluice gate that had cracked under the winter freeze, and eventually no supplies at all for a claim that could not survive a season without either. Su Lin watched him absorb this news at the supper table with the same flat, unshowy resignation he seemed to bring to every setback, and found herself, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, angry on someone else's behalf rather than her own. She had spent 6 weeks in Pruitt's tent, learning exactly how a ledger could be weaponized against a person with no recourse, and she was not willing to watch the same thing happen to the one person in this country who had treated her as though her name mattered. She proposed, over supper, a solution that surprised even herself with its boldness. She would keep Nathaniel's books herself, transparently, in a ledger he could read at any time, and she would present that ledger, along with a formal request, to the railroad's paymaster's office at the grade camp 2 miles further up the canyon, where Central Pacific kept its own scale, independent of Whitlock's trading post entirely, used for weighing the powder and supplies the railroad itself purchased from independent claims. It was a longer walk, a colder errand, and it meant dealing directly with railroad company men who had even less reason than Whitlock to extend courtesy to a Chinese woman presenting herself at their office uninvited. But it was also, she pointed out, the only path that did not require Whitlock's cooperation at all. The walk to the railroad grade camp took most of a frozen morning, along a route that climbed past the snow sheds already under construction to protect the future line from winter avalanche, past tunnel mouths where crews of mostly Chinese laborers worked the granite face with hand drills and black powder in conditions Su Lin had heard described but never witnessed directly. She had known, abstractly, that thousands of her countrymen were working the railroad grade somewhere in these mountains, but seeing it directly, The scale of the operation, the timber trestles spanning ravines, the sheer improbable ambition of cutting a railroad through solid granite by hand, struck her with a force she had not anticipated. She wondered, walking past a crew breaking for their midday rice, whether any of them might have news of her brother, whether Wei might be one of the distant figures she could not make out clearly enough to recognize, and she filed the thought away to pursue later, because today's errand required every ounce of composure she could hold in reserve. The paymaster's office was a plank building at the edge of the grade camp, staffed by a company clerk named Mr. Halloran, who looked up when she entered with an expression that suggested he did not often receive Chinese women presenting ledgers at his counter, and who might, on another day, have dismissed her outright. But Su Lin had prepared for exactly this reception. She laid Nathaniel's ledger on the counter, opened to the relevant pages, and explained. In English she had rehearsed the entire walk up, precisely what Whitlock's counter had done, and precisely what documentation Nathaniel needed in order to have his claims dust wade through the railroad's independent scale instead. She did not plead. She presented figures, the way her father had once presented figures to skeptical merchants, and she watched Halloran's initial skepticism shift, incrementally, into the particular attentiveness of a man who recognized competent bookkeeping when it was placed in front of him, regardless of who was holding the pen. He weighed the sample of dust she had brought, cross-referenced it against the figures in Nathaniel's ledger, found them accurate to within a fraction of an ounce, and told her, with something that might have been the beginning of respect, that Central Pacific would be glad to weigh independent claims dust going forward, provided the paperwork remained this clean. She walked back down the canyon with a signed authorization in her bundle and a feeling she did not immediately recognize, because it had been so long since she had felt it, of having solved a problem entirely on her own strength rather than survived one at someone else's mercy. Nathaniel's relief when she returned with the signed authorization was quiet in the way most of his reactions were quiet, but she had learned by now to read the smaller signs, the way his shoulders dropped a fraction, the way he read the document twice before setting it carefully on the table rather than simply glancing at it and moving on. He told her, that evening, that he had not expected her to solve the problem so completely, and that he was not certain he would have thought to approach the railroad's office at all, having spent 3 seasons assuming Whitlock's scale was the only game in the canyon simply because it was the one everyone used. She told him in return that she had grown up watching her father navigate merchants who tried exactly Whitlock's trick, and that the solution had not required cleverness so much as refusing to accept the first man's monopoly on the truth. It was the most she had said about her father, or her family, or her life before the debt, in the 6 weeks she had lived under his roof, and she watched him receive the information carefully, without pressing for more than she offered, which she was coming to understand was simply how he handled everything that mattered to him. He asked, after a silence, whether she would tell him about her brother sometime, not tonight necessarily, but sometime, because he had gathered there was a brother somewhere in this story, and he found he wanted to understand the shape of the debt she had carried across an ocean, not to settle it for her the way he had settled it with Pruitt, but simply to know her more completely than a name and a jade pendant could convey. She said she would, and found that she meant it, and that the offering of the promise loosened something in her chest that had been tight since the letter about Wei's injury first arrived. The trading post's business with Whitlock never fully recovered its old monopoly. Word spread among the smaller claims that the railroad's scale was both more accurate and open to independent miners, and within a month, a dozen other claim holders had made the same walk up the canyon that Su Lin had made first, all of them owing the discovery, whether they knew it or not, to a woman Whitlock and half the camp had assumed had no standing to challenge anything at all. Spring arrived in the canyon the way it always did at that elevation, reluctantly and then all at once, the snowpack breaking into runoff that swelled the creek past the sluice gate and turned the trail to the trading post into a churn of mud that swallowed boots to the ankle. With the thaw came the season's real labor, and Su Lin found herself working the claim alongside Nathaniel in ways that went well beyond the herbal medicine and bookkeeping that had first justified her place at his table. She had grown up with a farmer's practical hands even in a merchant family, and she took to the physical rhythm of placer mining faster than either of them expected, learning to read the creek's gravel for the telltale black sand that indicated gold nearby, learning the particular rocking motion of the pan that separated heavy metal from worthless silt. Nathaniel taught her without condescension, correcting her grip on the pan the same unadorned way he corrected anyone's technique, and she found she preferred his bluntness to the careful, patronizing gentleness other men in the camp affected around her, as though her foreignness made her fragile rather than simply unfamiliar with a specific American tool. It was during this stretch of shared labor that the shape of their arrangement began, without either of them naming it directly, to change. She noticed it first in small things, the way he had begun setting 2 cups out for tea without being asked, the way he had started walking the long way around the cabin's second room, rather than passing close enough to seem to be checking on her, a courtesy she recognized as its own kind of statement. She noticed it in herself, too, in the way she had stopped mentally cataloging the exits from any room she entered, a habit she had carried since Pruitt's tent and had not realized she was still practicing until the week she noticed she had stopped. She was not yet certain what to call the shift, only that it existed, present in the space between them at supper and in the unhurried quiet of afternoons working the sluice side by side, and she was not yet certain either what she was permitted to want from a country that had spent 6 weeks treating her as freight before this one man had treated her as a person, or whether wanting something more than shelter and safety here was a door she was ready to open. The trouble that spring did not come from Whitlock, who had retreated into a sullen, watchful silence since the Ledger incident, but from a claim-jumping dispute that erupted 2 ridges over and rippled through the entire camp with the speed such disputes always seemed to travel. A newcomer named Garrett Voss had staked a claim overlapping the boundary of a modest operation belonging to an elderly widow named Mrs. Odell, arguing that her late husband's original filing had lapsed on a technicality and that the ground was rightfully open for a new claim. It was, by any fair reading of the camp's own recording book, a naked land grab dressed up in procedural language, and most of the camp knew it, but Voss had cultivated exactly the kind of respectable friendships, with Whitlock, with several of the churchwives' husbands, with the camp's part-time sheriff, a man named Del Rourke who owed Voss money from a card game, that made challenging him socially costly. Mrs. Odell, frightened and unable to read the filing language herself, had gone to Sue Lin for help translating a legal notice Voss's lawyer had sent, having heard through Delphine Ashworth that the miner's woman up at Cole's claim had a head for figures and documents that put half the camp's men to shame. Sue Lin read the notice twice, recognized in its wording the same kind of deliberate obscurity Whitlock had used to disguise a tilted scale, and told Mrs. Odell plainly that the claim to a lapsed filing was false. The original filing date, checked against the camp recorder's own book, showed no lapse at all, only a Voss-friendly clerk's convenient miscount of the renewal deadline by exactly 1 week. She helped Mrs. Odell draft a formal challenge, citing the correct dates, and delivered it herself to the recorder's office, an act that required walking through the center of camp past the trading post, past the chapel, past every person who had spent the winter debating what kind of woman lived up at Cole's cabin. He arrived at the recorder's office within the hour, loud and furious, and when he saw Sue Lin still standing at the counter, he said, in front of a growing crowd drawn by the noise, that it was rich for a camp to take land law lessons from a Chinese servant girl who had been bought off a broker's slate 2 months earlier, and that decent men in this camp had better start deciding whether they wanted their claims settled by American law or by whatever a foreign woman decided to whisper into a widow's ear. Word reached Nathaniel at the claim within the hour, carried by a boy sent running up the canyon by Delphine Ashworth, who had watched the confrontation from the trading post porch and judged, correctly, that Nathaniel would want to know before rumor distorted it further. He came down the trail faster than Sue Lin had ever seen him move, arriving at the recorder's office to find the crowd still gathered, Voss still holding forth about foreign servant girls and American law, and Sue Lin standing exactly where she had been standing when the confrontation began, her spine straight, her face carefully arranged into the neutral composure she had learned to hold since Pruitt's tent, giving Voss nothing to escalate against. Nathaniel did not raise his voice. He walked through the crowd, positioned himself beside her rather than in front of her, a distinction Sue Lin noted and would remember, and told Voss, in the same flat, unadorned tone he used for everything, that Sue Lin had not whispered anything into anyone's ear. She had read a public filing correctly, which was more than the recorder's own clerk had apparently managed, and that if Voss wanted to dispute her arithmetic, the camp's recording book was sitting open on the counter behind her for anyone to check. He said it loudly enough for the whole crowd to hear, which was, Sue Lin understood immediately, entirely the point. Not a private reassurance meant only for her, but a public statement staked in front of every person in camp who had spent the winter gossiping about what she was worth. Voss, cornered by an argument he could not counter without admitting he had not actually checked the dates himself, retreated into blustering about respect for American institutions. But the crowd's attention had already shifted, a few of the older claim holders murmuring that Voss's filing had smelled wrong from the start, and that a man who needed a foreign woman to be the villain of the story instead of his own paperwork was not a man whose judgment they trusted going forward. The sheriff, Rourke, arrived late enough to see which way the crowd's sympathy had turned, and rather than backing Voss as his card debt might have inclined him to, he announced, with the practical instinct of a man reading a room correctly, that the recorder's book would settle the matter and that everyone should get back to their claims. It was not a triumphant ending. Voss would remain in camp, sullen and unforgiven, for weeks, but Nathaniel had chosen, in front of the entire town, to stand beside her rather than let her stand alone, and Su Lin understood that this choice would cost him something in the camp's regard that he had decided, deliberately, he was willing to pay. The cost arrived in smaller, colder forms over the following weeks. A supply order at the trading post mysteriously delayed twice before finally filling. An invitation to a camp barn raising that pointedly excluded Nathaniel's household while including nearly every other claim within 2 miles. A Sunday sermon from the circuit preacher who visited once a month that dwelt, with suspicious specificity, on the biblical dangers of yoking oneself to foreign influence. Nathaniel absorbed each slight with the same flat composure he brought to everything, but Su Lin noticed the toll it took regardless, the way he had begun, for the first time since she'd known him, to second-guess small decisions he would once have made without hesitation, as though wondering whether each choice might cost him further standing he could not afford to lose. She found herself, one evening in early April, apologizing to him directly for the position her presence had put him in, the first time she had voiced the guilt she had been carrying since the confrontation at the recorder's office. He listened to the whole apology without interrupting, which she had come to recognize as his particular way of taking a thing seriously, and then told her, plainly, that she had misunderstood what had actually cost him anything. It was not her presence that had cost him the barn-raising invitation, or the delayed supply order. It was his own decision to stand beside her in public, rather than let her absorb Voss's accusation alone, a decision he did not regret and would make again exactly the same way if the moment repeated itself. He said that a man who only stood on principle when it was free to do so had not actually demonstrated any principle at all, only convenience dressed up as virtue, and that he would rather lose a barn-raising invitation than lose the version of himself capable of setting coin on a crate for a woman he had never met, because that man, whatever the camp thought of him now, was the only version of himself he actually respected. Su Lin sat with that answer for a long time after he had gone out to check the sluice gate one final time before dark, turning it over the way she turned her jade pendant, and understood, with a clarity that startled her, that she had stopped thinking of her position at his cabin as shelter she was grateful for, and started thinking of it as a life she was, cautiously, beginning to want to keep. The final escalation came in mid-April, when a fire broke out in the trading post's storage shed during a dry spell that had followed the spring thaw, destroying a season's worth of powder reserves and several claims' worth of unclaimed supplies before the camp's bucket lines could contain it. In the chaos and recrimination that followed, someone, Su Lin never learned who, though she suspected Voss or one of his card game friends, began circulating the suggestion that the fire had started because a Chinese lantern, of the kind hung outside laundry tents in the camp's small Chinese labor quarter, had been left burning too close to the powder store, an accusation with no evidence behind it beyond the convenient fact that blaming the camp's Chinese workers required no further investigation and offended no one whose good opinion mattered to the accusers. The rumor gained enough traction within a day that a delegation of trading post regulars, Voss prominent among them, began talking openly about restricting Chinese workers' movement through the central camp entirely, a measure that would have crippled both the laundry operations and the herb trade several Chinese workers had built up over the 2 years since the camp's founding, and that would have made Su Lin's own presence at the trading post, already tolerated rather than welcomed, effectively impossible. Nathaniel heard about the delegation's talk from Delphine Ashworth's husband, who had refused to sign the petition circulating in support of the restriction and had been called a traitor to the camp's safety for his refusal. Nathaniel went to the meeting called to discuss the measure formally, held in the half-built chapel that doubled as the camp's only space large enough for a general gathering, and Su Lin, against his gentle suggestion that she stay at the claim where the discussion would not further inflame anyone watching her, insisted on attending herself, because a discussion about restricting her movement, conducted entirely without her present, felt like exactly the kind of decision made about her, rather than with her, that she had promised herself. Crossing the ocean, she would no longer accept, without at least being heard. The meeting in the half-built chapel was loud before Su Lin had even taken her place near the back doorway, Voss and his allies arguing that camp safety required decisive action, Mrs. Abigail Reyes seconding the motion with the particular moral certainty she brought to every public pronouncement, and a scattering of quieter voices, the trading post clerk's husband among them, arguing without much force that the fire's cause had never actually been established. When the floor opened for anyone to speak, Nathaniel stood, and the room's attention swung toward him with the wary curiosity of a crowd that had spent 2 months watching to see how far he would carry his unpopular loyalty. He did not defend Su Lin directly, which surprised her until she understood his strategy. Instead, he asked, plainly, whether anyone in the room had actually inspected the storage shed's ruins for the source of the fire, and when no one answered, he said that he had, that morning, before the meeting, and that the shed's own oil lamp, hung on its usual hook near the powder crates by the trading post's own clerk, showed clear scorching consistent with having tipped from its bracket, a bracket that had been loose and complained about for a month by at least 3 miners he could name. He said the Chinese lantern theory had appeared conveniently after the fact, attached to no witness and no evidence, offered by men who found it easier to blame a community that could not easily answer back than to admit the trading post's own equipment had failed. The room's temperature shifted, incrementally, the way it had shifted at the recorder's office weeks earlier, several older miners nodding at the mention of the loose bracket, which apparently had indeed been a known complaint. It was Su Lin, though, who delivered the argument's final weight, stepping forward from the doorway despite Nathaniel's earlier caution, and speaking not in defense of herself but in the plain language of fact. She described, briefly and without embellishment, how her own countrymen's laundry lanterns were hung, always at a careful distance from any flammable store, a practice born of exactly the caution that came from people who had learned, across generations, what fire could do to a settlement built entirely of canvas and timber. She said that blaming her community for carelessness they had specifically trained themselves out of, while ignoring a documented loose bracket on the trading post's own lamp, was not caution, it was convenience, and she said it in English that had grown, over 4 months at Blue Canyon, clear and unhesitating enough that not one person in that chapel could claim afterward they had not understood every word. The vote to restrict Chinese movement through camp failed that night, not by an overwhelming margin, but by enough, and Su Lin walked out of the chapel beside Nathaniel into the cold spring air, understanding that something in how the camp saw her had shifted permanently, whether or not every person in it was ready to admit it yet. 2 weeks after the chapel meeting, a letter reached Blue Canyon, addressed to Su Lin, in a hand she recognized instantly, despite its unsteadiness, and she read it standing at the trading post counter, with her breath held, because the last letter in that hand had told her Wei was injured and could not write, and any letter after that could carry either recovery or worse. It carried recovery, of a kind. Wei had healed enough to hold a pen again, though the injury to his hand from the tunnel blast had left it permanently stiffened, and he wrote that he had been given lighter work on the grade in recognition of his years of service, tallying supply counts for a foreman who had taken an interest in his arithmetic. He wrote that he had heard, through the long, unreliable chain of camp gossip that connected railroad workers across 100 miles of grade, that his sister had ended up at a claim near Blue Canyon, under circumstances he did not fully understand, but had been told involved a miner who had paid off Pruitt's ledger outright. And he asked, with the careful formality of a younger brother, uncertain how much to presume, whether she was safe, and whether the debt that had brought her across an ocean on his behalf was truly settled, because he had spent every month since his injury turning over the guilt of what his own passage had cost her. Su Lin wrote back that same evening at Nathaniel's table, describing Blue Canyon, the cabin, the sluice, the herbs she had begun cultivating in a small garden bed behind the cabin, using seeds traded from another Chinese worker's wife, 3 claims over, and Nathaniel himself. Though she found herself uncertain, writing the words, how precisely to describe what Nathaniel was to her, settling finally on a man who has treated me as though my name were the only thing about me that mattered from the very first night, which felt truer than any title she might have assigned him. She told Wei that the debt Pruitt had invented was gone, paid outright and never to be recalculated by anyone's dishonest ledger again, and that if his foreman would grant him leave, she wanted very much for him to come see the place she had built for herself in this country, before he decided whether Gamsan had been worth what it cost either of them. Wei arrived at Blue Canyon on a clear morning in early May, walking the last mile from the grade camp with a foreman's brief leave papers folded in his pocket and his stiffened hand held slightly close to his body out of old habit, and Su Lin saw him from the trading post porch before he saw her, and crossed the muddy street at a pace that abandoned every careful composure she had built over 4 months of being watched and judged by that same street. The reunion drew its own small audience, curious townspeople pausing to watch a scene that carried, even to strangers, the unmistakable shape of a family reassembling itself after a debt-driven separation. And for once, Su Lin found she did not mind being watched, because there was nothing in this particular moment that needed defending or explaining. Nathaniel met them partway, offering Wei his hand in the plain, unceremonious way he offered everyone his hand, and Wei, who had clearly rehearsed some formal speech of gratitude on the long walk from the grade camp, found himself instead simply thanking Nathaniel for feeding his sister well, an observation so practical and so entirely in keeping with Nathaniel's own manner that it startled a short laugh out of the older man, the first Su Lin had heard from him in longer than she could remember. Over the following 2 days, the longest visit Wei's foreman had permitted, Su Lin watched her brother examine every corner of the life she had built, with an attention she recognized as his own particular love language, asking Nathaniel detailed questions about the sluice's yield, inspecting her herb garden's neat rows with an approval that meant more to her than she had expected, sitting up late by the fire trading stories of the 2 different labors that had brought them each, by such different roads, to the same range of mountains. Wei told her on the second evening that their mother, in the last letter he'd received before the family's contact grew intermittent, had asked only whether Su Lin was somewhere safe, and Wei said he could now write back with an honest answer, because whatever Blue Canyon had cost her getting here, she had clearly built something real on the other side of the cost, a home rather than merely a shelter, and a man who had chosen her publicly rather than simply tolerated her privately. He left on the 3rd morning with a jar of her dried herbs for the grade camp's makeshift infirmary, and a promise to write more often now that his hand could manage a pen, and Su Lin watched him walk back down the trail until the pines swallowed him, feeling for the first time since leaving her village that the ledger of what she had lost and what she had gained had finally, however imperfectly, begun to balance. By midsummer, the claim above Blue Canyon had changed in ways visible to anyone who walked the trail up from camp, though the changes had come so gradually that Su Lin herself had barely registered each one as it happened. The herb garden behind the cabin had expanded to a proper cultivated bed, supplying not only Nathaniel's household but a small, steady trade with other claims, and even, grudgingly, a standing order from the camp doctor who had once dismissed her medicine as foreign superstition and now quietly purchased her fever root whenever his own supplies ran short, careful never to mention the arrangement in public, but reliable about it nonetheless. The ledger she kept for the claims accounts had become, without anyone formally deciding it, the ledger both of them consulted and trusted, and word of her arithmetic had spread quietly enough that 2 other claim holders had begun asking, hesitantly, whether she might look over their own books for the kind of errors Whitlock's counter had once disguised. Nathaniel's cough never returned with the severity it had carried that first February, and the sluice, repaired and expanded with the season's better yield, had begun producing enough that he had started speaking. In the unhurried way he spoke about everything significant, of building a proper second room onto the cabin before winter. Not the spare room with its inward latch that had first sheltered her, but a room built new, for a household rather than an arrangement. Su Lin had not answered him definitively yet when he first mentioned it, turning her jade pendant the way she still did when a decision required its full weight, but she had noticed that she no longer thought of the trail down to Blue Canyon as a walk toward a place that judged her, only as the walk toward a trading post where Delphine Ashworth would nod to her, where the assayer's office ran an honest scale now that half the camp checked the counter out of habit, where her own name, spoken correctly, no longer drew a single raised eyebrow from anyone who mattered to her. The camp had not become a paradise. Voss remained sullen at the card tables, and Mrs. Reyes still crossed the street rather than exchange pleasantries. But the ledger Pruitt had once used to price her like freight was long since closed, replaced by one she kept herself, in her own hand, recording a life she had built rather than a debt she had merely survived. And when Nathaniel asked her again, one warm evening at the end of July, Standing beside the sluice with the whole valley gold and green below them, whether she might consider that new room built for two names instead of one, she found the answer waiting in her chest fully formed, and gave it to him in the language she had arrived speaking only in fragments, now sure enough to need no translation at all.